after the devastating Black Summer bushfires. We are still in that summer as we speak. I said some weeks ago now that it would be necessary for us to move forward with a national Royal Commission. At the same time, the states and territories are proceeding as we anticipated and as they said they would, and is appropriate with a series of inquiries that they're running at the state and territory level as is appropriate. Today, the Governor-General issued letters patent to establish the National Royal Commission into the Black Summer fires. That Royal Commission is about three things: improving natural disaster management, coordination across all levels of government, improving Australia's resilience and adaptation to a changing climate, living in hotter, longer, drier summers in this country, and importantly, a legal framework as is necessary for the Commonwealth's involvement in responding to national emergencies. One of the great challenges of the Black Summer fires has been how they impacted on so many different states and indeed territories, often at the same time. We will all remember the day that a state of natural disaster was declared in Victoria. It was on the Thursday, I recall. We'd had the terrible fires that had been raging also through New South Wales to such devastating effect. By that Saturday, 2 days after, we had the first compulsory call out of the reservists, which saw our numbers increase from 890 to 6,500 in a matter of weeks, when as a Commonwealth we decided to take the initiative and to put more boots on the ground. And I'm sure everyone all over the country that is affected by those fires was so grateful to see those boots on the ground. And I want to thank General Elwood and everyone who's been involved in that operation, which continues to this day, Operation Bushfire Assist, with the way they've been conducting that operation, providing tremendous support to communities and great relief all across the country. The Royal Commission will be led by the former Chief of the Defence Force, Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, and he will be supported by two other commissioners, a former Federal Court Judge, the Honourable Dr Annabel Bennett, and by Professor Andrew McIntosh, who is a specialist researcher in climate change mitigation and adaptation. This Royal Commission accepts, it acknowledges, it understands the impact of climate change more broadly on the climatic conditions that Australia is living in. What this Royal Commission is looking at are the practical things that must be done to keep Australians safer and safe in longer, hotter, drier summers, in the conditions in which Australians will live into the future. So that's dealing with the practical things that need to happen on everything from preparation to response and, importantly, recovery. In framing these terms of reference, we circulated and sought comment from the states and territories, and I thank all the premiers and chief ministers for their feedback and input into that process, and we've listened carefully to those responses, and we've made adaptations as necessary to ensure that the Royal Commission will enable the commissioners to look at this issue very much from the position of the national perspective. And that national perspective, as I said, will look at what is the arrangements when you could have a national state of emergency or disaster declared. There is no such power. There is no such declaration that currently exists, and therefore no consequent powers or authorities or actions that would flow from such a declaration. And so it's important to discuss through, particularly when you have natural disasters that are occurring across multiple states, how that would be put in place. What would be the conditions? What would it then do? And how would that integrate and work with the state and territory effort? It's also important, I think, as Australians have said very clearly, that they want a greater national perspective on these issues. And so it is important to ensure that when we're talking about issues like hazard management, hazard reduction, when we're talking about vegetation, native vegetation management, when we're talking about building standards and controls and planning and land use laws, that we have a greater national consistency in our understanding of what the best practice is and what the standards are and what the plans are and what the accountabilities are using common methodologies, so Australians can get a national picture of how we're tracking. These are clearly and absolutely and should forever be the responsibilities of states and territories. This isn't about changing who does what. This is about how we work together even more effectively, and we build on the disaster recovery arrangements that have been put in place by previous governments but have been tested on this occasion because of the multiple jurisdiction nature of this disaster. We've also seen across these latest fires some inconsistency in how the application of the various Category A, B and C assistance has been declared in different states and territories. When you're only operating in one state, or there's only one jurisdiction that's been affected, well, those inconsistencies don't present because they're declared by the states. But when you have it happening at Kangaroo Island and you have it happening up in Canungra and you have it happening in Bateman's Bay or East Gippsland at the same time, then obviously it's important that Australians should have the same expectations of the level of support that they might receive in those circumstances. Now, we've worked together to do our best to ensure that has been as consistent as possible. And I make no criticisms at all of the state and territory governments, and in particular those who led the first line of defence, the first response in combating the fires themselves. The volunteer fire brigades, the emergency services departments and all of these organisations. This is an opportunity to have a National Royal Commission which looks at the ways that the national coordination, the national consistency, the national standards, the national measurement and the national powers and authorities that need to be put in place, that those questions can be considered and they can be assessed. Now, it is important that this be done in a very rapid fashion, as the states are also doing. So 6 months has been set aside for this inquiry. It needs to report back by the 31st of August of this year. That will also give them, based on the reporting timetables for the state and territory arrangements, a month to consider the recommendations and the inquiries that have been undertaken at that level. Now, this isn't an inquiry as to whether the truck should have gone down that road or gone down some other road. The states are looking at those operational issues, and that's why it's important that there be close collaboration between this National Royal Commission with the state-based inquiries, particularly that are occurring in New South Wales, South Australia and in Victoria. And I would hope that that would be the case, because the more they work together, the quicker they can get the job done, the quicker the premiers, chief ministers and I and the relevant emergency services and management ministers around the country can get on with the recommendations.
Isn't this Royal Commission about justifying your argument in the dispute with New South Wales in early January about sending in the reservists, and also about showing the states haven't done enough on hazard reduction? Isn't it about saying the states aren't up to it, and in particular New South Wales?
No, it's not, Andrew. No, it's not, Andrew. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a pretty cynical view. What it is about is ensuring that the Commonwealth and the states have clear understandings of the legal arrangements that enable the Commonwealth to act, for the states and territories to act, for us to work together. I'm not making any criticisms of the states and territories. I was pretty clear about that in my opening statement. We're working together with the states and territories. When you have a devastating impact of the Black Summer fires that we've had, you've got to learn the lessons, and you've got to look at the ways you can do things better. And when we moved to put over 6,500 Defence Force personnel in and boots on the ground, we did that in a constitutional grey zone, but with the great permission also of the states and territories, so those issues didn't arise. So I'd expect Mark Minskin, as a former CDF, to know what the sensitivities and the legal issues are here, and then what the practical issues are. This is about assisting us all, Andrew, to ensure that we can make Australians more safe in longer, hotter, drier summers in the future. It's not about conflict, it's about action, and it's about making people safe.
But you believe New South Wales were recalcitrant. They did the wrong thing, don't you? That's your personal view.
No.
So it was okay for them not to request that, those reservists at that time?
No, Andrew, I'm not going to have you put words in my mouth. What I'm saying is we need to know the answers to these questions. Australians, their safety needs the answers to these questions so we can better protect them. It's not about politics. I know the media likes to focus on politics, obsessed by it. But Australians are interested in their safety, and this National Royal Commission is about their safety.
Prime Minister, how would state of national emergency laws change the Defence Force's involvement in New South Wales during the recent bushfires?
What we're seeking to understand is how our Defence Forces can be in a more proactive position to provide support, not to fight the fires. There's no suggestion here that Defence Forces would be trained in fighting fires. The people who fight fires in this country are overwhelmingly our volunteer fire brigades, supported by our state governments, resourced by them, trained by them, run by them, under their command and control, and they do an amazing job. I think one of the clear lessons from the recent disaster has been that where we've been able to get those Defence Force personnel in more quickly and more promptly, and then that has provided great relief and comfort to those communities. And I don't think the states and territories have any issues with that at all. And so this just enables, I think, a more effective partnership.
Would these laws have seen them come into New South Wales, though, into fighting that or being involved in that effort sooner? Well,
look, I think that's a retrospective analysis that the Commission will certainly look at, and as they should. But what's more important, this is why I've commissioned a National Royal Commission. I'm interested in them doing the work and providing that advice. I'm doing this because I want them to inform the answers to those questions appropriately. And, I've asked a former judge, a former Chief of the Defence Forces, and a scientist, a professor who has experience in dealing with climate change adaptation. So these are experts who can give us shed a lot of light on this. Working with what the states and territories are doing, I think it will help us give us a lot of answers to help make people safer in the future.
But you were frustrated with New South Wales, weren't you?
No, I'll let you be frustrated for 1 second, Andrew, and let PVA get a question in.
Prime Minister, would you like to see the Royal Commission hear evidence from the former fire chiefs who tried to warn you about the impending catastrophe before it happened but couldn't get access?
It's up to them who they call and how they call and when they run their meetings and how they run their hearings. They have the powers to conduct those open hearings, and that'll be a matter for the Royal Commission.
But do you think they should hear from them?
I don't give the Royal Commission running guidance on how they run their commission. That's for them to do. It's an independent Royal Commission. The idea that the Prime Minister would somehow be seeking to direct them in any way like that, I think, would be highly inappropriate. It's up to them.
Prime Minister, is 6 months enough for this inquiry given the devastation of the Sun's bushfire?
Well, it's the same length of time that has been done for the state inquiries, and they'll be looking at a lot of operational matters in particular. It's important that we get this done quick, because we need to ensure that we have advice coming back to us, particularly as we go into next season. There's already been an enormous amount of work that has been done here by previous Royal Commissions, and one of the things they've been tasked to do under this terms of reference is to effectively audit the implementation of those recommendations, and I am aware that there's been a lot of good work already done in the research community and scientific community on those issues, so I think they'll be able to draw on that quite readily and be able to move forward into the other areas of their inquiry.
Would you give evidence yourself if you're called upon? Do you anticipate that occurring?
Well, it's not that usual, but the Royal Commissioner has those powers.
Prime Minister, I know you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in some respects, but did you think...
No. No, surely not, PVA.
But did you think really hard about whether to go down the Royal Commission path or not? This idea of having so many Royal Commissions. A lot of people wanted it.
Did.
Some people didn't.
I did. I thought very deeply about this as we were actually working through the recovery arrangements, and let's not forget, as I said, state of disaster declared on the Thursday in Victoria. Reservists call out compulsorily for the first time ever on the Saturday. On Monday, the National Bushfire Recovery Agency had not only been stood up, it had a head and it had a budget of $2 billion. More than half of that has already been committed in a matter of weeks soon after that. At the same time, I was also considering how we needed to move to the next stage of learning from what had been a devastating bushfire crisis that had resulted in the loss of many, many lives. And those lives lost, whether they were those who were fighting the fires or those who were the victims of them, deserve these answers. And their families, they deserve these answers, and they deserve it at that level. And so I believed it was important to establish something at that level at the right time. I didn't want it to begin while particularly the agencies were very involved in the direct bushfire fighting response. And I think both the states, particularly New South Wales and Victoria and ourselves, we didn't rush to putting this together, but we knew it would be necessary. And so coming to the view, it was then about, well, what should it be focused on? It doesn't need to overlap, and I don't believe does with this terms of reference, what is being done at the state level. What it's doing is trying to understand from the national perspective, what are the things that nationally the federal government should be focused on in how it responds, and they fall into three areas. As I said, one is whether there should be a national state of emergency at a statutory level that engages particular powers for responses and certain responsibilities. And there need to be clear safeguards about how that can be used. That will have implications for our Defence Forces and how they prepare and their command structure in these issues as well. And I flagged that when I spoke to the press club. The second one is, how can we ensure as a federal government that nationally Australians can have a greater sense of confidence that things like hazard reduction targets are being met and are being measured on the same basis, as well as the many other practices that are managed at a state level, that they are meeting standards and that they're reporting against them, and Australians can have that confidence. That sunlight is a very good way of doing that. And the third area is to acknowledge that we are living in hotter, drier, longer summers. And that means building our climate resilience, both in responsiveness and preparedness, as well as the longer term arrangements we need to do with adaptation. So that's what we have to focus on, and this Royal Commission will assist me greatly and the rest of the Cabinet in responding to those issues, as I believe it will support COAG and the leaders of the states and territories.
What's the cost? What's the cost of the Royal Commission?
That's still being finalised, but to give you a guide, the 12-month cost of the Banking Royal Commission was just over $50 million. It's just going for about half that time.
So the Prime Minister there announcing the terms of reference for this Royal Commission that's looking into the bushfire, that horrific season that we've had over the past couple of months, with more than 30 people dying and thousands of properties destroyed. So there's three key areas that this Royal Commission will look into. The first two are ones about improving natural disaster management and also improving the preparedness and the way that we manage the climate going forward. The Prime Minister very much saying that Australians have to expect hotter, drier and longer summers in the years ahead. So explaining that in simple terms as to what the Royal Commission will actually look at, it'll be things like hazard reduction burns across the different states. Is there a way that there can be more of a national approach and ensure that adequate hazard reductions do take place? Other areas such as building codes, do they need to change? Land management issues too, zoning issues that are usually at a local and state level. The Prime Minister there saying this Royal Commission will look at whether there's a more national approach that can be taken. And the third point of this Royal Commission that will be a big focus is about the legal framework for the Commonwealth. And what I mean by that is, at the moment, if the federal government wants to send in Defence Force members, as we saw over the past few months, it needs permission from the states and territories to do so. And the Prime Minister there in that press conference, and he has said it in the past, raising this idea of essentially giving the federal government the ability to send Defence Force members in if they decide that it is a natural disaster, a natural emergency, and not having to wait on others to make that move. So all of these issues will be discussed in the months ahead. We've got 3 commissioners leading this inquiry, and we're hoping that it will start in a matter of weeks.
Okay, and what's the expected timeline?
Yeah, so the Prime Minister wants the Royal Commission to wrap up and with all the recommendations made by the end of August. Now, this has been criticised by some, saying that it's too short, it's not long enough considering how many issues need to be worked through. But Scott Morrison says that timeline is necessary and it can't be moved because obviously we are having another summer at the end of this year where conditions are expected to be bad again, and he's keen to try and put in some of those changes that this Commission is expected to make before we reach that, October, November dates.